Seeing the response to this show in some online circles and communities that I have things in common with, I am not fully joking when I say I'm kind of worried I'm going to get burned at the stake for this. Agatha All Along. It's done. And that means I'm finally going to talk about it. People have been asking me intermittently in comments mostly, are you going to talk about this show? And I have said the whole time, probably not until it's over. Well, now it's over. I'm actually really, really glad I didn't talk about it as it was airing because despite what some people seem to think of me, I don't like being negative. And I could tell that lots of people were having fun with this show. And I don't want to be the person who's just a grump the entire time. Like, if I'm at a party I'm not enjoying, yeah, I may be in the corner not participating and not seeing what everyone else is having fun over, but I'm not going to moan loudly about it because that will spoil their fun. Once the party's over, yeah, I'll complain. Party's done, now I'm going to complain. But I'm not trying to dampen anyone's enthusiasm or kill their enjoyment for this. If you liked it, that's great. I can see a lot of the reasons why people do, and I understand them, even if I don't share a lot of them, or if I do, it's not enough to overcome the other stuff that I don't like. Although, I should probably clarify the thumbnail, which says, I hate Agatha. There's a reason it says that, and not, I hate Agatha All Along, because I don't hate this show, mostly, but I do hate its lead character. I do not like Agatha at all as a lead. And the thing is, I thought that was something worth examining. Now, maybe it's not to you as more than a curiosity, because maybe I'm the only freaking person who cannot stand her, but maybe you'll stick around and hear my reasons why, if only for curiosity's sake, even if you're tilting your head at me going, what is your problem? Well, let's talk about what my problem is, shall we? Firstly, let's acknowledge a couple of things. One is, I didn't come into this with the most positive feelings. I try not to come in having prejudged something to be bad. I'm not going to say it never happens, but it's pretty rare, because generally if I'm highly confident that something is going to be flatly bad, I generally avoid it most of the time. I mean, that's why I still haven't seen The Flash, for crying out loud, or Black Adam for that matter. But there's another aspect to this, which is that Agatha ruined WandaVision. Now, not Catherine Hahn. She's great. She's a wonderful actress, great presence, good for the direction they took this character. I'll come back to that in a second. But if you haven't seen my video on WandaVision, we'll stick a link in it up in the corner there for that. But while not everything that went wrong in the back end of that is because of Agatha, her reveal did happen at the point at which the whole thing went to hell. Short version, if you haven't seen or don't want to go back and watch that video, that show had no business having an outside villain showing up at all, especially that late in the game. She seemed to exist for no other reason than A, to set up the Darkhold for Multiverse of Madness, and B, to grant Wanda a big wizard fight in the sky. Yay. That is not the ending this thing was building to. The core conflict of this was Wanda's inability to process her grief. You want to know what the climax should have been? It should have been an extension of this confrontation between Wanda and Vision.
You don't want to know, I promise you.
You don't get to make that choice for me, Wanda!
Because it should have been him who really truly made her confront what it was she was doing to these people. Instead, they bring in this outside force who just happened to be there. And even though she got that song that everybody liked more than I did, it's fun, it's fine. But despite the song saying it was Agatha all along, Agatha did nothing. It was Wanda all along, but Agatha came in and pulled focus and just completely threw the thing off its axis. So there is that negativity that I have going into this project. There's also the fact that I find Agatha Harkness to be a really fascinating character in the comics, and this is not her. This is a pretty sharp deviation. And I haven't had that happen a ton for me with too many characters, like even characters who have deviated a fair bit. More often than not, I've understood why they've done that. Honestly, I would rather they just picked a different character than Agatha to do what they ended up doing with this. But despite that negativity that I'm sorry, I can't do anything about, those were the feelings I had about the character coming in, I did try to accept it as best as I could. And it started out not awful. The look that we got of Agatha still kind of trapped in Westview mode and sort of the weird direction she'd gone in from there, seeing herself as a cop on the edge, was interesting. And then she became herself again, and it became less interesting. Although I did say my problem is her, not the show overall, mostly. So the thing is, part of what doesn't work about Agatha for me is how good a lot of the other stuff is. So I could be really reductive and say, Agatha doesn't work because she's a bad person and she's a lead character. But that is incredibly reductive, and also, like, that can't be it. There's plenty of things that I have liked with awful people in the leads. The thing is, in my mind, there's a couple of ways to do that, and this fails to do either of them. One is you can have an awful person who still has some redeeming point or some point of sympathy or empathy that you have with them basically from the start. So take House. Awful person, terrible guy, bad to his friends, bad to just people in general. But he is a doctor and he is saving lives. You have Loki, god of mischief, caused massive damage, wants to cause more. But by the time he got his own show, we had gotten a few points of sympathy for him with things like the loss of his mother. And then when we see him process his own fate of just never achieving anything, that existential crisis that they gave to him in the first episode of the Loki series did a lot to endear him to me as someone to continually watch and see what happens. Some other examples, Dexter, serial killer. And like, he has an impulse. He wants to kill people. He has his dark passenger egging him on, but he only targets other killers. And so there is something admirable or relatable or sympathetic about these characters from the start. Agatha doesn't have that going on, at least not for me. If you want to make the argument that the state Wanda left her in gave you sympathy for her, okay, it didn't for me. She was too terrible a person. I'm not saying that having your personality overwritten is a fair and just thing to have happened to her, but I didn't feel bad for her. I'm sorry, I didn't. The other way to have a character who is deplorable, awful, but you still kind of latch on to them is to have them command your attention so well that the fact that they're terrible isn't detracting. In fact, you get sucked in watching, oh my gosh, what are they gonna do next? And that is something that, like, say, the TV show Hannibal did. Now, Hannibal also had a foil, which was helpful. I'd argue Agatha does not have an equivalent foil, but he is never depicted as anything even vaguely redeemable. He is practically the devil in that show, but it zeroes in and it commits to focusing on him and making you watch. This is your hook in. If you're here for this guy. But they didn't do either of those things. Agatha, again, for me, is not a sympathetic character. There is nothing that I find particularly empathetic, sympathetic. There's nothing positive she brings to the world. The fictional world, that is. And that's a problem for me. Now, I get some people find her fun. I think a lot of that is carrying on from how much they liked the Agatha All Along reveal in WandaVision, which again, I didn't, so maybe I'm coming in at a little bit of a disadvantage as far as that goes. But she doesn't take center stage enough for her to work as the core focal point for a bad person the way that Hannibal did, or arguably Walter White in Breaking Bad did. That one's slightly weird because he starts out a little bit sympathetic, but it isn't too long before he heads in a direction where you go, oh, you're just awful. And they let that be the front and center core thing of this. But Agatha frequently gets sidelined by characters who are, to me at least, more compelling, more sympathetic, and more fun. Like, you can have a character who is a fun kind of bad. Like, this is a bad person, but, like, they're fun. Spike from Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Good example of that. But at the same time, he is a side character. But the thing keeps coming back to Agatha as its central character, despite the fact that it is frequently deviating to all these other people who I like more than her. And I think part of the problem is it's not just that she's selfish. It's not just that she's self-serving. And this gets reaffirmed by the last episode. Spoiler warning, I am just going to talk about the whole thing. That she just always intended to kill them. That was her goal from minute one. And that, while there's some interesting stuff with that reveal, I'll get to it eventually, that didn't really shock me. There was no surprise in that. Like, yeah, no, that tracks. That's who she is. And that might have worked if I didn't like the people that she was hurting more. That's a problem. That's why Dexter works, because he is harming worse people than him. Agatha is not. And again, it doesn't quite pull off the Hannibal thing where it's so central and focused on that it's compelling regardless. She's so often sidelined, especially in the single best episode of the show. So let me deviate from complaining about Agatha in specific and acknowledge some of the positives. Episode 7, the one focusing on Lilia. That is a phenomenal piece of television. Not just an excellent episode of this show in specific, but just television in general. It is really, really good. It is fantastically structured in a way that really takes advantage of these little moments that have been sprinkled throughout and had just been written off as like, oh, she's just having a little bit of a moment. She has those. But then we realize she's experiencing some of time out of order. And these little snippets of her outbursts were longer thoughts that were getting broken up in these ways. And to see her come to an acceptance of that, to see what she does with the reality of what her life is and has been, is beautiful. It's wonderfully executed. She gives a phenomenal performance. It is a great piece of television. And nothing else in the show even comes close to it. But, credit where credit is due. When this show fires on all cylinders, which is, for me at least, basically only episode 7, it does really work. But then it has to come back to Agatha again. And I just don't like her. I don't want her to succeed. Now, it tries to inject some sympathy into her at the end, in the literal last episode. Well, I mean, tiny hints across, most heavily in the second to last, but we get the full story of what happened to her son in the last episode. And I'm not going to say that it is an unemotional or unsympathetic portrayal. The problem is it's too late. If you saw my video that I made on The Shining, I talked about the idea of something feeling like backfill. Now, when I say feels like, I do mean feels like. I'm not literally accusing it of being this. Now, backfill is something that happens in serialized stuff that is long going. And when an author realizes that there's something that they need, often a character detail or an event that they should have covered before, or an aspect of a character that they thought was clear, but the audience isn't getting. And then they will put something in a later chapter, kind of backfilling like, oh, but there's this about them that you didn't realize. Oh, this thing happened off panel, off screen, off camera, before. And yeah, but that's something that we probably should have known earlier if this was going to work properly. Again, it's something that happens in truly serialized works, not works that are written as a complete piece like this. And yeah, like, it's a serialized show. Yes, it's telling one story over its episodes, but I mean serialized in the sense of like a comic book, or heck, fan fiction chapters for that matter, or the way that books like Phantom of the Opera, these serialized things that would hit later points and the author would realize, oh, dang it, I forgot that. Or they suddenly realized there was something they should have done and they backfill it. And that's what it feels like the stuff with Agatha and her son is. And I know it's not literally that. It was planned to be put here. But this is the only point that it really actually tries to make her a sympathetic character as far as I am concerned. And it does succeed a little, just not enough. Because what it shows me is that for the however long he was alive, between 6 and 10 years, that for better half of a decade, Agatha was a slightly less horrible person. at least insofar as her treatment of her son. However, she didn't stop killing people during that time. In fact, she was using her son to make it easier. So while it may have been intended to make me more sympathetic towards her in a way that maybe would ripple back and impact my thoughts on the earlier episodes, it just doesn't. Because what it actually shows me is, okay, she was an awful person before she had a kid. She was an awful person after her kid died. And while she had her kid, she maybe tried briefly to be a little bit better, but then as soon as he wasn't there, she went back to being an awful person. Maybe part of it is the world that we currently live in and the kinds of people who either have or are trying to attain power, but the idea of, oh yeah, this is a terrible person, but they love their kid doesn't quite fly right with me anymore because, there's lots of awful, awful, awful people in the world who are more or less doing right by their own immediate family, their offspring, or what have you. That doesn't really cut it for me these days. And I don't mean to bring the real world into this. It is a piece of fantasy, but it is a shift in my perspective that is impacting my ability to have something like the reveal of what happened to Nicholas and her time with him just kind of bounce off me a bit. And again, I'm not saying it isn't effective in the moments when it's happening, but again, it's just not enough because I'm not going to clear from my brain everything else that she has done. And I know that like a bad and terrible person having like this one redeeming feature, it's kind of a classic. It's a staple. I'm not saying it doesn't necessarily work at all, but when that's what you're trying to do to make me care even slightly or have any sympathy or affection for the literal lead of the show, yeah, no, sorry, that's not gonna cut it. I guess another way they were trying to build sympathy around her has to do with the way her mother was portrayed. This kind of goes back to WandaVision as well. And the way that her mother talks about her and like this idea of you were born evil, I think, like, I don't know if they're purposefully trying to tie that into Agatha's queerness because the way that her mother talks about her is kind of reminiscent of the way that puritanical-minded people, either in entertainment or real life, will talk about queer people. But the thing is, if that's what they're going for, that doesn't work. She's a witch. You're taking a witch and you're coding her as a Puritan? Like that was too confused to work as a point of sympathy for me. And I'm not even positive that's what they were trying to do. But if it was, that bounced off me. So I mentioned the other characters being ones who worked better for me. And the thing is, part of that is also working better in the things that Agatha should be good at. When I think about what makes a lead character who's a bad person work, one of the things is be really fun. And because of who she was hurting, I didn't find her fun. You know who I did find fun? Rio, aka Death. I found her quite fun. Fun in the way that I would have expected them to try and make Agatha herself, but they don't. They instead pad that off to a side character who ends up taking that role within the show and doing it, frankly, better. As far as sympathy goes, I've got way more for actually basically everybody in the thing, which does bring me to a few things, because I did say I don't hate the show mostly. There are a couple of things that I actually think are kind of issues and problems, even aside from Agatha. One is Billy, the actor does fine. It's very cool seeing him in a comic accurate outfit at the end. Cool, I like it. He is inconsistently characterized. And I've said that to some people who have looked at me sideways, and it's becoming one of those things like, is nobody else seeing what I'm seeing? And this mainly comes down to the tail end of episode 5 and the bulk of episode 6. Because at the very end of episode 5, he kind of comes into his power. He takes over Lilia and Jen and has them throw Agatha into the mud, which Agatha then does crawl out of, but he also flings Lilia and Jen into the mud where they sink and do not emerge from. And he does not seem to care. That is really weird given his big hang-ups later on at the end of, oh my gosh, I killed them, because he's responsible for the actual manifestation of the Witch's Road. Why didn't you care the first time you thought you killed them? This is a fairly classic writing mistake, which is that because the writers know that those two characters aren't dead yet, they don't have the proper weight hit the other characters because, like, well, they're going to find out they're fine anyway. Yeah, but that makes characterization on Billy really inconsistent because he seems to care about these people even before that, flings them into the mud, thinks they're dead, has no reason to think they're still alive, but then just marches on with Agatha like nothing at all happened. And again, yes, granted, they turn up later, but he doesn't know that. And that is so inconsistent with how he is tearing himself up in the last episode over the idea that he's responsible for anybody's death. So he's inconsistently written, first of all. Second of all, since we mentioned character deaths, let's talk about those. I hate them. There's really two major ones that we need to deal with because Lilia's is great. I said that episode's great. That includes her death, so set that one aside. But there's Sharon and there's Alice. Sharon just struck me as cruel. And I mean narratively cruel. It's not even exemplifying cruelty of characters because it's not like anybody chose to have her die. So this isn't the characters being cruel. This is the story being cruel because Sharon shouldn't have even been there. She had no idea what she was getting into. She was literally dragged there and she dies and her death is punctuated by a joke.
Who's Sharon?
Twice. Once at the end of the episode where we find out she's dead in the first place, and then at the start of the next episode where they're still dealing with that, we get another joke.
Well, shall we?
That is how they frame the death of a woman who didn't know what was going on, didn't want to be there, wouldn't have volunteered if she had known, was dragged there, and died. And I know some people will argue, oh, but the witch's road is cruel. That's what it's telling us. We got that. We got that it was cruel and unfair just from the test. Having somebody actually die as basically an afterthought doesn't show anything that we haven't already seen. I did not like it at all. And then there was Alice. You spent a whole episode, one of the better ones, nowhere near episode 7, but still, we spent a whole episode going over what was going on with Alice. The generational curse, the weight that she has been carrying her entire life, and she struggles to stand up to it, but she does. She stands up to it, and with the help of the others, she overcomes it, and she eliminates this curse that has hung over her for her whole life. And in the next episode, she dies. Fuck you. Yeah, seriously, f*** you for that. Because you want to talk narrative cruelty. Well, you just gave a character a new lease on life and then immediately killed them. And I'm not going to say there's no way that you can do that or make that work. I've seen shows where something like that has happened and it's often been played darkly, comedically. This isn't, though. So this isn't going for that kind of thing. It's not even really going for tragedy because it's not fate that happens to her. It's Agatha. Agatha kills her. And as much as Agatha might protest, I couldn't help it, we know she can. She does with Billy later on. Some people may choose to believe her when she says, I can't help it. But I look at her face when that's going on, and my thought is, I don't believe you. You know what you're doing, and you're doing it on purpose. You could stop, and you're not. And if you want to try and make it a, like, oh, but it's an addiction parallel. If it is, it's not fully built up as one. I don't really think they pulled that off if that was the intent. If you relate to it on that level and it works for you because of that, okay. But again, when she says, I couldn't help it, I don't believe her. And so Alice dies. And the show had the audacity to hang a lampshade on how wrong that was. To have her point out how messed up it was that she just got her life to be her own for the first time and she died immediately. Yeah, all that tells me is that you knew what you were doing, you knew why this was messed up, and you did it anyways. You know what? It's been a while since I pulled this clip.
If you know it's bad, why are you doing it?
Now, like, cosmic unfairness could have been a theme of something like this. If we're going to deal with this witch's road that is just cruel, okay, but that's not really a running theme. It's certainly not consistent if it's meant to be. So both those character deaths ticked me off. But let's circle on back to Agatha one last time. I really feel like the show wanted it both ways with her. Because you can watch her laugh and the bliss on her face when she's being bad and acquiring power or thinks she's going to get what she wants. And then you contrast that with the moments of like, oh, but the pain of losing her kid. Like, you're trying to do two different things that you are not focusing on her enough as a character for them to reconcile and gel. Because they're trying to simultaneously do the really fun bad person thing while at the same time trying to do the sympathetic bad person thing. Pick a lane. I'm not saying you can't do both, but if you're going to, you need to sideline most, if not all, of these other characters and put a proper full focus on her if you are going to get the time in to make that work. And they don't. And there is cleverness here, even outside of episode 7. The fact that it is indeed true, the road was never real until Billy made it real, that's an interesting notion. While I do really like the Witch's Road song, it was repeated so often that it did start to feel like, is there only one song in this universe? A bit like Baldur's Gate 3, which has an amazing soundtrack, but that Down by the River song circles back around so much. You're like, does anyone here know a second song? So there is still cleverness in it. And I get what people enjoy about it. There are certain aspects of this that are filling a niche that is absent. This sort of creepy Halloween-y vibe. That sort of Scooby-Doo type of, it's not really scary, but it's got scary aesthetic to it. Like, I get why they dropped both the final episodes the day before Halloween. It would not make sense to wrap this up in any other month. So I understand that we are lacking in stuff that feeds in that. I suspect that's also why Beetlejuice was as successful as it was, despite that thing being a complete mess. But it's feeding an aesthetic and a type of visual experience that we just don't get a lot of anymore. I get that. Similarly with just witch narratives in general. We are lacking for witchy stuff, and I would love more things to give me the feeling of something like The Witches of Eastwick or The Craft. But I can't help but feel like this is being embraced for being something that we're lacking, but that doesn't make it a good example of that. And I suppose I'd be remiss not to touch on the queer aspects of it, because yes, this is easily the gayest show, the gayest anything that Marvel Entertainment, Marvel Studios has put out. Because we have the love between Death and Agatha, we get a lesbian kiss, we get a gay male kiss between Billy and his boyfriend, and those are both aspects integrated deeply enough that it's not something that you could just easily cut, like the single line of acknowledgement we got of Loki's bisexuality in the first season of his show. So in terms of queer representation, big improvement, most improved, honestly, and that's good in the broad sense, but I'm not going to automatically like something just because it fits an aesthetic that I like, is in a genre that I would like to see more of, and happens to have queer stuff. Like, those would help. Those would take something that I liked and make it something that I love. But it can't take something that I'm at best ambivalent about and make me more than go, okay, there's some good stuff here. Because ultimately, for all the other stuff that I am and love, I am a story person first. I care about connecting with characters and narrative. And this thing's biggest successes are one single episode that is almost flawless, and the aesthetic touches, the frosting. But the cake underneath it isn't quite working in this ham-fisted food metaphor, the cake is the narrative and the characters, and that is ultimately what I connect to more than anything else. I am hard-pressed, unless it is just being sold to me as something, this is just trashy fun, don't take it too seriously, and I guess some people might be enjoying this on that level, but to me it seems like it's trying to be more than just trashy fun, and maybe that was its ultimate mistake. Maybe this should have been trashier. Maybe this should have had less serious moments. Well, maybe not. Like, Lilia's episode was pretty serious, and it is the best one. But again, it stands out so far, it's almost anomalous compared to the rest of the show. But there is still good elsewhere in the show, just almost none of it is about Agatha. I think that they latched on to the meme craze of her. And we're like, well, we got to do something with this. And I'm not going to say that they just were trying to cash in. This does feel like it had thought put into it. But that doesn't mean that Agatha was ever a character that was going to work as a central figure. And if she was, you needed to either give me a reason to think that she had any redeeming features prior to the literal last episode of the show, or you needed to just let her be fully bad and let me enjoy the fun of that. Because I don't find her fun. She's causing too much tangible pain to people who I do like for me to have fun with her. And I suppose I'll also express a little bit of gratitude that they didn't really do a redemption through death thing. I've got an entire video on why I don't like that trope, and it looked like they were going to do it, but they did soft pedal it enough that I'm like, fine, whatever. And again, I don't mean to be the party pooper on this. I don't. But while I am really glad I wasn't doing episode by episode reviews, I still need to get my thoughts out there. And I don't mean like I feel obligated, like I want to. I want to talk about this. And so here we are. And you know what? The last thing I'll say about Agatha All Along is that for all my frustration with it, with trying to enjoy it and liking some of it, I am glad it exists. In a lot of ways, this has kind of fallen into a similar realm for me personally as a viewer as The Acolyte did for Star Wars, which is, this isn't quite working, but I like enough of the general thing of what it's doing, and I like what its existence will hopefully do for the franchise overall. I'm glad Agatha exists, and unlike The Acolyte, this has the potential to actually be a positive impact because reports are they kept a very tight control on the budget of this one. Good. They should not have spent a ton of money on this, and they didn't, which means the threshold for success is much more reasonable. I legitimately actually hope this does well. For as much as you've just heard me complaining, I think its existence is a good thing for Marvel in general, Marvel television in specific, Disney Plus. I think this is a good thing to have, and I hope it does well, not because I love it, but because what its success could signal that we get more of. Because like I said, a lot of what this is doing I like and want more of. I just don't want it from her. I've had enough. I've had my fill of her. So that's my thoughts on Agatha All Along and why a fair amount, especially the lead character, did not work for me. I don't know how bad I'm going to get roasted on this. People, like, my general hope is you don't have to agree with me. I'm not trying to convince you to think the way I think. My hope is to just explain why I think what I think. So at the very least, you can go, I don't agree, but I understand. That's more than anything, that's all I'm hoping for. But whatever your thoughts on any of this are, drop something down in the comments and let's talk about it. Be polite. You can disagree with me, just don't be rude. Patreon pays the bills, enables me to do this as my living. You get various perks. Normally, videos are up a week in advance. That wasn't the case for this one because I had to turn it around so quick after the finale. But usually, you get a week advance as well as other perks. You get to see the docket for a given month at the start of the month, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But even if you can't help me out that way, like, share, subscribe. Those are all helpful as well. But what I really want you to remember is that you are beautiful. You are valid. You are loved. And you are not alone on whatever road you're walking. You are the council, and I'm just running the meetings. And until next time, this council is adjourned. And now to give thanks to my highest supporting patrons: Robin Moore, Zubin Lutfula, Goddess Elida, Welsh Wrestling Geeks, Oliver B., Melissa Pedersen, Movie Turtle, Ulrich Bogdan, Loki Eris, Melinda Walters, Auntie Kate 808, Becky Sparks, Bernabe Likes the Poodle, Tracy Scrabbit, Angry Kasparov, Dave Hall, Quite Bearish, Rosalind Bennett, Adam RDL Taylor, Pau Baraba Jago, Mira G, and Sir Didymus is my favorite. I don't know, it feels right that it's October the first time you're seeing all three of these at the same time.